My son-in-law thought I was just a frail, retired woman who was easy to fool. So under the guise of helping me, he tricked me into signing away my paid-off house to cover his secret, dangerous debts. He and my own daughter then trapped me in their home, took my phone, and smiled to my face while they bled my life savings dry. They thought they had me right where they wanted me, but they had no idea that I was about to turn my daughter's perfect baby shower into the public crime scene of his epic downfall. You know, the air in that Myers Park sunroom was so heavy with the scent of lilies, it was hard to breathe. It was one of those expensive climate-controlled rooms where you couldn't even hear the outside world. I just sat in my armchair and watched my son-in-law Brent. He was like a hummingbird on caffeine, flitting around the room with this charm that was so bright it felt fake. He was arranging gift bags and fussing over a tower of cupcakes, and he let out this laugh that was just a bit too loud, a bit too forced. He kissed my daughter Lila on the temple, telling her the cupcakes had to be right there so everyone would see them the second they walked in. And Lila, bless her heart, she just beamed at him. 8 months pregnant, she looked absolutely luminous, and she told him he thought of everything. Watching them, I felt this knot tighten in my stomach. I'd driven 12 hours straight to be there for the baby shower, and for 2 days Brent's cheerfulness had been relentless. It was exhausting. It was in the way his eyes would flick down to his phone every few minutes, the way I'd catch the muscles in his jaw bunching up when he thought no one was looking. That wasn't the easy confidence of a successful man. It was the frantic energy of someone trying to keep a dozen plates spinning at once. The whole thing started so subtly, this feeling of being put in a cage. The day before, my old neighbor Carol had called to chat, and Brent just swooped in and took the phone right out of my hand. He told her I was resting my eyes after the long drive and would call her back, then hung up before I could say a word. He put my phone on a high shelf with a wink, saying he needed to keep me off my feet, that it was doctor's orders for all grandmas to be. He said it all as if he were just being thoughtful, but it didn't feel like care. Then my rental car keys disappeared from my purse. I saw them later sitting in his valet tray by the door. He just waved it off, saying there was no need for me to go anywhere, they had everything covered. That morning, the final lock on the cage clicked shut. Brent came and sat beside me, his face a mask of sincerity, and he was holding this handsome leather folder. He leaned in, his voice low and serious, and told me that with the baby coming, he and Lila wanted to make sure everything was streamlined for the future. He opened the folder to a document just filled with dense legal language. He explained it was just a formality, a way for him to manage some of my assets by rolling them into a new family trust he was setting up. He said it was a better tax structure, that it would protect me, protect the baby. The smart play, he called it. I tried to push back. I told him I'd managed my own finances for 40 years, that my house was paid off and my pension was solid. He just sighed this patient, condescending sound and said that while I'd done an amazing job, this was the big leagues now. New South money, he said. He was talking about generational wealth, about making sure his child, my grandchild, was set for life. He slid a single page from the stack and pointed to the signature line, telling me this was all they needed for the initial filing. The rest was just boilerplate for my records. Just then, Lila drifted over and put a hand on my shoulder. She asked me to please do it for the baby, that Brent was so good at this stuff, and it would make him feel so much better. And looking into her eyes, my own daughter's eyes, I saw they were clouded over with this trusting fog I couldn't seem to penetrate. I was trapped between his slick confidence and her misplaced faith, and I just felt this wave of complete exhaustion wash over me. What did I know about generational wealth? I was just a retired office manager. So with a heavy heart, I took the pen and signed my name. My signature, usually so neat and practical, just looked foreign and frail on that page. Later that night, the house was finally quiet. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, and as I passed by Brent's office, I heard his voice. It wasn't the smooth, charming tone he used with us. It was a low, panicked hiss. He was telling someone on the phone that he didn't care what some man had said, that the collateral was secured and the wire would be there. The deadline was Monday. He just needed until Monday. He paused, and I could practically feel the desperation trembling in the air. He insisted the person on the other end didn't understand that these weren't people you could just ignore. This wasn't a bank, he said. If he defaulted, he trailed off, then just repeated that he had it handled. Monday. He hung up, and the silence that followed was 100 times more terrifying than his words. I just stood there in the hallway, frozen, the glass of water, completely forgotten, in my hand. He hadn't been talking about a family trust. He was in trouble. Deep, dangerous trouble. And in that awful, sinking moment, I knew exactly what the collateral was. It was the document I had signed. It was my paid-off house. The terror that hit me in that hallway was cold and sharp, but it didn't last. After a lifetime of managing chaotic offices and emotional executives, I learned one thing: panic is a useless emotion. It clouds your judgment, makes you sloppy. I didn't have room to be sloppy. So the next morning, I moved with a deliberate calm that I'm sure they mistook for resignation. What I needed wasn't hysterics, it was data. I found Lila in the nursery, humming softly as she folded a onesie no bigger than my hand. Brent was downstairs on the phone again, his voice a low, urgent murmur. This was my opening. I kept my own voice light and conversational as I picked up a little stuffed elephant from the crib. I asked Lila about the document I'd signed, saying I was so tired from the drive I hadn't gotten a good look. I wondered aloud if that was the one for the new educational trust Brent had mentioned last month. It was just a simple question, a pebble tossed into what he thought was a still pond. The ripples were immediate. Lila's hands stopped moving. A shadow of confusion crossed her face as she told me, no, it wasn't an educational trust. It was for the big family fund to protect my assets. She was just parroting his words, I could tell, but the certainty was already gone from her voice. Right on cue, Brent walked in, a brittle smile plastered on his face. Lila told him I was just asking about the papers, and his eyes darted to me. For a split second, I saw it, the raw, primal fear of a cornered animal. He recovered instantly, of course, wrapping an arm around Lila and launching into an explanation. He told us the educational trust was phase 2, and what I signed was the foundational document for the primary trust. It had to be done first for the tax advantages, he said. Standard procedure. I just feigned confusion. I mentioned that it was just so hard to keep up with Lila, saying it was a full family fund, and now he was calling it a primary trust. The contradiction just hung there in the air. That's when Lila's memory seemed to spark. She looked from him to me, a little crease of distress forming between her brows, and reminded him that he'd said it was to move money around for that big real estate deal, the one that was supposed to set them up for life. Brent's smile got even tighter. He told her the trust facilitates the deal, that it was all connected. Then he shot a look at me that was pure venom. It was a silent, furious command to drop it. But it was too late. The lie was clumsy, hastily patched together, and it revealed everything. These weren't criminal masterminds. They were amateurs. That realization didn't comfort me. It terrified me. Amateurs are unpredictable. In the chaos of their conflicting stories, I saw my chance. I put a hand to my head and said it was all too much for my old brain, that I needed to sit down. I faked a little dizzy spell, and as they both rushed to help me, fussing and guiding me to a chair, I palmed the old pay-as-you-go burner phone I keep in my purse for emergencies. While Brent was in the kitchen getting me a glass of water, I slipped into the guest bathroom, my fingers flying across the keypad. Carol answered on the second ring. I knew I only had a few seconds. I spoke in a tight whisper, telling her to do a public record search on my name and address to look for any new liens or loan activity from the past 48 hours. I told her I needed a lawyer who deals with fraud, a shark. She started to ask what was going on, but I cut her off. I told her he'd taken my real phone, that she shouldn't call me, I would call her. Then I hung up, my heart pounding against my ribs. When I walked back into the living room, Brent was waiting with the water. The look on his face was one of predatory concern. He asked if I was feeling better, then he picked up my regular smartphone from the end table. He thought the stress was getting to me, he said. He suggested he hold on to it for me so I could just relax until the party. No more calls, no more worries. They would take care of everything. He slid my phone into his pocket. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a confiscation. The gilded cage had just become a prison, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I was in far more danger than I had ever imagined. For the rest of that day, I played the part they had cast me in. I became a frail, slightly confused retiree, completely overwhelmed by the excitement of the baby shower. I took a long nap, or at least I pretended to. I came out and praised Lila's choice of decorations, letting my voice sound a little shaky. I allowed Brent to handle everything, nodding meekly when he launched into some convoluted explanation of his financial strategies. Their relief was so thick you could feel it in the air. They really believed the storm had passed, that their patched-together lies had been enough to placate the old woman in the corner. Their arrogance became my shield. That evening, I told them I had a headache and retired to my room early. But I didn't sleep. The real work was just beginning. While I was pretending to be weak, Brent was out on the travertine patio facing a terror far more real than me. The cool night air did nothing to quell the fire in his gut. I didn't hear the call myself, but I saw the aftermath on his face later, and it wasn't hard to piece together what happened. He was on the phone, his voice a low hiss, telling someone that he had been given 2 weeks, that the deadline was Monday. The voice on the other end, I imagine, was utterly without sympathy. This wasn't a bank. This was an employer who was not a patient man. An employer who knew that all 3 of Brent's real estate flips were underwater, who had seen the lien on my property, and was wondering why the money hadn't been wired yesterday. Brent tried to lie, of course, claiming the funds were clearing, that it was a bridge loan with a holding period. But the man on the phone wasn't buying it. He gave Brent a new deadline, noon the next day, right in the middle of the baby shower, and he made it clear that if the money wasn't there, his employer would start taking collateral of a different kind. He mentioned that they knew where Brent lived, knew all about his pretty pregnant wife and the party she was having. It would be a shame, he'd said, to disrupt it. When that call ended, Brent wasn't just a failure anymore. He was a fool who had gambled everything on men who didn't sue. They collected. The thought of what they could do to Lila, to the baby, that was his real nightmare. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was terrified of them. My house wasn't just a way out anymore. It was the only thing standing between his family and a horror I couldn't even imagine. While he was outside being consumed by his terror, I was at my own battle station. I had an old tablet tucked away in my suitcase, and it connected to their guest Wi-Fi with a sluggish reluctance. My fingers were steady as they moved across the screen. First, my bank accounts. Empty. Wiped clean. A single large transfer to an LLC I'd never heard of. My stomach lurched, but I pushed the feeling down. This wasn't a tragedy yet. It was just data. I sent a secure message to Carol with the name of that LLC. My old friend is a research bloodhound. If anyone could follow that trail, it was her. Next, I found the website for the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds. I typed in my own address and my breath caught in my throat. There it was, filed the day before a uniform commercial code lien for $450,000 against my property. The lender was the same LLC that had taken all my money. Then Brent made his mistake. High on his victory over me and sick with his own secret panic, he got careless. Confident I was asleep, he brought his work briefcase into the dining room. From the crack in my bedroom door, I watched him leave it wide open on the table when he went to get a drink. As soon as he was gone, I slipped out. Inside the briefcase was a folder with the LLC's name on it. I didn't have time to read everything, and I didn't need to. A single sheet of paper right on top had the wiring instructions for the loan payoff, and at the bottom, a name and a number under a simple heading, Hard Money Lender. I took a picture of it with my tablet, my movements swift and silent. I had it. I had the connection. I had the proof. I retreated to my room, my heart beating like a cold, hard drum against my ribs. He thought he was dealing with a fussy old woman who didn't understand the big leagues. He had no idea he was dealing with Nora Hayes, the woman who had balanced the books for a 50-person firm for 30 years and could spot a padded expense report from 50 paces. The game had changed. Here is Chapter 4 continuing the story in the requested style. The morning of the baby shower dawned bright and oppressively cheerful. You know the kind of perfect Carolina day that feels like a personal insult when your world is falling apart. The house was already buzzing with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with excitement. Caterers were arranging miniature quiches on silver platters, and a florist was fussing with a massive centerpiece that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Brent was the picture of the successful host, dressed in crisp linen, his panic from the night before, expertly hidden behind a mask of charm. And my Lila, my poor, radiant daughter, floated through the rooms in a pale blue dress, her face a perfect portrait of blissful ignorance. Just before the guests were scheduled to arrive, the doorbell rang. Brent, probably expecting another flower delivery, opened it with a broad, welcoming smile. That smile didn't just falter. It froze and died on his face. Standing on his pristine porch was my friend Carol. She's a small, unassuming woman with the kindest eyes you've ever seen and a will of pure iron. She was holding a large, beautifully wrapped gift, and beside her stood a tall, sharp-faced man in a suit that was so expensive it looked menacing. Carol just breezed past a stunned Brent, chirping about how she was in the area and couldn't resist dropping the gift off in person. She introduced the man as her nephew David, a lawyer who had some papers for me to look over. David stepped forward, and his eyes, cold and precise, locked onto Brent. He introduced himself as David Morrow, stating clearly that he was there on my behalf. The atmosphere in the foyer just crackled. You could feel the air change. Lila came over, her happy smile faltering as she tried to understand what was happening. Carol gave me a quick, sharp nod. That was it. That was my cue. I stepped forward, my voice perfectly calm, perfectly clear. I told Brent that David had some questions about the lien he'd placed on my house yesterday. From his briefcase, David produced a single sheet of paper. He held it out, explaining to Mr. Cole that it was a printout from the county's public records. It showed a lien for $450,000 against my property with Brent as the guarantor. And then David dropped the hammer, adding that the lender was a hard money firm known for its particularly aggressive collection tactics. Brent turned a color I can only describe as ash. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Lila's voice was just a thin thread of confusion as she asked me what the man was talking about. She looked at Brent, her perfect world starting to fracture right in front of her eyes, and reminded him that the trust was supposed to protect me. But David wasn't finished. He continued, his voice relentless, bringing up the matter of my bank accounts. He explained how all the funds had been transferred to a shell corporation that Brent controlled. And he stated very clearly that this wasn't asset management. It was felony wire fraud. Those words, lean hard money wire fraud, just hung there in the pristine sunlit air. Brent stared at the paper in David's hand as if it were a death sentence. And in that moment, his facade didn't just crack, it completely exploded. A choked sob tore from his throat, and his whole body seemed to collapse inward. He whispered that he had to do it. The words were ragged, torn from his soul. He looked at Lila, his eyes wild with a toxic cocktail of desperation and shame, and confessed everything. He told her the real estate deals had gone bad, that he'd lost everything. He admitted he'd taken out loans from very bad people and that they were going to hurt them. He told her about the terrifying phone call from the night before about the noon deadline that was now less than an hour away. He confessed to forging the documents draining my accounts, seeing my paid-off house as his only lifeline. He wasn't the slick mogul she'd married. He was just a terrified man who had gambled away our security and was now facing the consequences. Leela just stared at him, her hand pressed against her round belly, her face a canvas of dawning horror. The man she loved, the perfect life she cherished, it was all a lie. A house of cards built on my life savings. The power in the room had shifted completely and irrevocably. I was no longer the frail, confused victim. I looked at my daughter's shattered face and my son-in-law's pathetic, broken form, and I felt a cold, hard clarity I hadn't felt in years. I glanced at the clock on the wall. The first guests would be arriving in 20 minutes. I looked at Brent, my voice leaving no room for argument. I told him to go upstairs and wash his face. I told Lila to go with him. They needed to put on a brave face because their guests were about to arrive. They just stared at me, bewildered. Lila whispered, asking if we were still having the party. I told her yes. The party was going on exactly as planned, but the gift opening ceremony was going to have a new guest of honor. Here is Chapter 5, continuing the story in the requested style. You would have thought it was the most perfect party. The baby shower was a symphony of Southern charm, just like you see in magazines. About 30 women from Charlotte's most respected families filled that sunroom, and their polite tinkling laughter sounded like wind chimes. They were all complimenting the decor, praising the food, and touching Lila's belly while making little cooing sounds of joy. It was a flawless performance. But Brent, he moved among them like a ghost in his own home. His smile was a ghastly stretched thing that didn't reach his eyes. And Lila, my poor daughter, was pale but composed, looking like a fragile doll going through the motions. I just sat in my armchair, serene and watchful. I felt like a silent spider in the center of a glittering, beautiful web, just waiting. Finally, the moment came. One of Lila's friends clapped her hands brightly and announced that it was time to open gifts. They seated Lila in this large, throne-like wicker chair, and she was surrounded by a mountain of elegantly wrapped presents. Her hands trembled as she opened the first few: a silver rattle, a cashmere baby blanket, a designer diaper bag. And with each perfectly chosen gift, the tension in the room, a tension that only the three of us could feel, wound tighter and tighter. Then I stood up. A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on me. I told them that before Lila opened another gift, I wanted to say a few words about a very special gift, one that my son-in-law Brent had recently given me. I walked over to the gift table and picked up a large, flat box I'd wrapped in plain brown paper that morning. I saw Brent's eyes widen in terror. He knew. I continued, my voice light, almost sweet. I told the room that Brent was a man who always thought about the future, always looking for the next big deal to secure his family's future. In fact, Just 2 days ago, he was so concerned about my future that he had me sign some papers. As I spoke, I began to unwrap the package. Inside was a large foam presentation board. I told them that he'd called it a family trust, a way to protect me. And then I looked right at the most influential woman in the room and said, "Bless his heart." That phrase, usually so soft and comforting in the South, landed like a slap in the silent room. A few of the women shifted uncomfortably. I said that what he really gave me was this, and I turned the board around for everyone to see. On that board, I had neatly mounted a copy of the fraudulent document I had signed. Next to it was a blown-up printout of the $450,000 lien against my house. Beside that, a bank statement showing my life savings being wired to his shell company. And at the very bottom, printed in bold red letters, was the name of the hard money lender. You could have heard a pin drop. Then came this collective gasp that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. The polite smiles vanished, replaced by masks of shock and morbid curiosity. The soft tinkling of laughter was gone, replaced by the silent predatory gleam of smartphone cameras being raised to record it all. I announced to my silent captive audience that my son-in-law was in trouble. I explained that he was over-leveraged and owed a great deal of money to some very dangerous people. So he had decided to steal from me. He took my home, my savings, everything I had worked my entire life for, just to cover his own failures. I looked directly at Brent. His face was a ruin. The whole facade of the New South success story was utterly incinerated in that moment, leaving only the weak, terrified man underneath. My voice dropped to a steely quiet. I told him he had two options. My lawyer, David, stepped forward from the hallway where he had been waiting. I laid out option A. He would sign a full confession, a quitclaim deed, returning the title of my house to me, and sign over control of his LLC so we could liquidate its assets to pay back his lenders. Then I gave him option B. David would call the police right then, and I would press charges for everything. Fraud, forgery, elder abuse. The choice, I told him, was his. The judgment didn't come from me. It came from the 30 pairs of eyes staring at him from the silent recording phones, from the whispers that were already starting to ripple through the room. In that society where reputation is everything, I hadn't just exposed him. I had socially and financially executed him. Lila, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes finally clear of that manipulative fog, stood up and walked to my side. She looked at the man she thought she knew, the man she loved, and then she looked at me. She placed her hand on my arm, a silent statement of loyalty. Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken. Brent stumbled forward and took the pen from David's hand. You know, after a big explosion, you expect a lot of noise. But the aftermath of that party wasn't like that at all. It was a quiet, devastating collapse. The baby shower ended in a flurry of hushed apologies and hasty exits as 30 of Charlotte's most powerful women scrambled to get away from the blast radius. The news of Brent's public disgrace spread through those wealthy suburbs with the speed of a brush fire. His phone, which had once been ringing off the hook with deals and invitations, fell completely silent. We heard that his business partners dissolved their agreements overnight. Old friends would cross the street to avoid him. In a world where reputation was everything, he had become a pariah. His currency was gone. We saw him one last time a few days later. He was packing a single suitcase into the back of his leased BMW, which was apparently the only asset he had left. His face was gaunt and his eyes were hollowed out. He didn't look at me, but he looked at Lila, and for a second, I saw a flicker of something in his expression. I don't know if it was remorse or maybe just self-pity. He mumbled something about how he loved her, how he had just wanted to give her everything. But Lila's voice was cold and steady when she told him that what he'd really wanted was to give her a life built on my ruin. Then she just said goodbye. He got in the car and drove away, disappearing down that manicured street like a ghost leaving a haunted house. We heard later that he'd left the state, just ran from the mess he'd made. And the hard money lenders, well, David's legal work was impeccable. The LLC was liquidated, and they were paid off with the recovered funds. They just faded back into the shadows they came from. Lila's path was much harder. The betrayal left wounds so deep I wasn't sure they would ever heal. She began the slow, difficult work of therapy, of untangling the years of manipulation and gaslighting. There were days of terrible anger and days of profound grief for the life she thought she had. But with each passing week, I saw my daughter slowly returning to herself. The smart, strong, vibrant woman who had been buried under all of Brent's suffocating charisma began to reappear. As for me, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The first thing I did was put that big house in Charlotte on the market. It was tainted with bad memories, and it represented a life of performance and pressure that I no longer wanted any part of. I bought a small, sunny condo just a few blocks from Carroll back in my hometown. It felt like coming home. I reconnected with my old friends, joined a book club, and started volunteering at the local library. They put me in charge of organizing their historical archives, and I found that my meticulous skill for organization, the very thing my family had always dismissed as simple fussiness, was a gift. Months later, I was sitting in a rocking chair in my new living room. The afternoon sun was streaming through the window, warming my face. In my arms, I held my granddaughter, Amelia. She was so small, so perfect, and her tiny hand was wrapped tightly around my finger. Lila sat on the couch nearby, watching us with a soft, genuine smile that finally reached her eyes. The storm had passed. I had faced the monster, and I had won. Not with rage, but with relentless organization and a calm, quiet refusal to be a victim. I had reclaimed my home, my security, and most importantly, my daughter. I looked down at the sleeping baby in my arms, a new generation, a new and clean beginning. I had protected her future, and in doing so, I had finally, truly protected my own. I am Nora Hayes, and I will never be underestimated again. In the end, what Nora Hayes showed everyone was a powerful lesson in underestimation. The strength that truly matters is often the one nobody bothers to see. For years, she was just a quiet, organized woman, easily dismissed and overlooked. But when she was betrayed, that same quiet competence became the weapon that dismantled a life built on charm and lies. Her victory wasn't just about revenge. It was about proving that family is not a resource to be plundered, but a future to be protected. True power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the details.